Thank you everyone for joining us today. And before we begin, I'd like to remind you that you will all remain muted with your cameras off for the duration of our main discussion. To ask questions, you can send them in the chat anytime, and we'll go over them during the Q&A portion near the end. And don't worry if you can't stick around for the whole thing, we'll send you each the recording afterward. And at the end of our chat, there will also be a fun, casual networking session for those of you who are interested, just around 10 to 15 minutes long, so I hope to see many of you there. I'm Lauren from Arc.dev, a platform for hiring pre-vetted remote software engineers. So if you have any questions about Arc, I welcome you to reach out to me after the talk or visit our website, arc.dev, arc.dev. But for now, I'd like to turn our attention to our special guest, Sasha Connor, founder and CEO of Virtual Work Insider.
Hi, everyone.
So she has nearly a decade of remote management experience. She pioneered remote work at the Clorox Company, where she then spent 8 years remotely leading large distributed teams. She also founded the first ever virtual workforce employee resource group, which now serves over 750 global members. And now she uses her battle-tested strategies and tactics to train virtual leaders as an expert consultant at Virtual Work Insider. And she's here today to address the urgent challenge of remote employee burnout in 2020. And actually, according to a recent survey from FlexJobs, employed workers are 3 times as likely to report poor mental health now versus before the pandemic. So it's a really serious issue that all managers should be aware of. And one great thing about being a manager, being a remote manager, is that you have the power to decrease burnout risk and help improve the mental health and productivity of your team. And one way to do this is by ensuring that your team communicates efficiently and effectively. So today, Sasha will share best practices and concrete tips for better remote communication. So let's dive in. First, let's get to know Sasha a little more. Love to hear more about your background. So can you tell us about when you first became a remote manager, and what were some of the challenges you faced, and did anything surprise you about remote management?
Sure, I'm happy to jump in here. Yeah, and as we go, Lauren's prepared some questions for me, but also we'd love to hear from you and make sure we address whatever questions you have. So feel free to pop those into the chat as we go, and we will definitely get around to answering them a little bit later in the session. So back to your question, Lauren. So as you mentioned, I had an 18-year career in marketing and business leadership and sales and product innovation. So I started out my career agency side, so working for advertising agencies. And then I spent 14 years at the Clorox Company, 8 of which I was working fully remotely. So I was this kind of remote work pioneer experiment for the brand marketing function within Clorox, which is a $6 billion company. For those of you who are not familiar with it, it's a company that's headquartered in the San Francisco Bay Area in California, but is a multinational company, so a global company. And so back in 2010 is when I asked to move from the San Francisco Bay Area back to Philadelphia, where I live right now. So Philadelphia is on the East Coast of the US, and my family was based here. My husband's family is based here. So we wanted our kids to grow up near their grandparents and extended family. And so luckily I was given the opportunity to be this experiment, to see if I could do my job. And at the time that was running large new product innovation teams, to see if I could do that from 3,000 miles away. So 2010, so this is like 10 years ago. And, a lot of the things that we take for granted, especially from the technology standpoint, we didn't have back then. And so this was really, really kind of a new experience. I moved to Philadelphia, and, back to Lauren's question about when did I first become a remote manager and what were some of those challenges? Well, in 2010, when I made that move, what was interesting to me was that at first it actually felt pretty seamless, because if you think about it, like one day I went from working in office with a team with remote direct reports to the next day working with those same people 3,000 miles away. What was different was the day-to-day in-person interaction, but the good news was I had strong relationships already built with those people. So it actually felt pretty seamless in terms of the trust and relationship and that piece of it. What didn't occur to me was until after I went on maternity leave. So I went on maternity leave with my second child and came back and had whole new teams, whole new direct reports who I hadn't worked with before. And then I realized how challenging it was. And so I liken this to what a lot of people are experiencing right now during the pandemic, where they've had to move into these fully remote organizations, or frogs, if you will. And they had those relationships mostly established beforehand. So many of you are riding off of that wave of social capital that you built before you went remote. But what's going to start happening, if it hasn't already, which is that social capital is either going to be depleted or has to be renewed, because you have new hires coming into the company, because you've had people rotate, either people reporting into you or people that you're reporting to, and you're starting from scratch. So you have to really understand where you are in that cycle, and making sure that you're changing your approach based on how deep that social capital is with your manager and your direct reports.
Yeah, it sounds like it really depends on your team, the challenges you'll face and your situation, really. I mean, it sounds like it was lucky that your first move to remote was with a team you already knew, because that can be, that must be difficult. I've never done that, being the only, like, meeting everyone for the first time remotely. So I know that a lot of people talk about culture building as being a challenge, like relationship building. So now that you've moved to being a consultant and helping other teams face these challenges, what challenges have you seen remote managers face this year in particular? So how is managing a remote team in 2020 different from the norm?
So I think it's always been about relationship and trust building, whether you're in person or remote, but that's becoming even more important in this environment. And I think a lot of managers have really good intent. And where I see managers struggling or asking questions right now is trying to understand that balance between coaching their people and micromanaging. And in some cases, some managers are leaning toward micromanaging because they feel like they have lost control, the control that they used to have by being within earshot and eyeshot of their teams. And so they actually are legitimately micromanaging. But then there's other people who are so afraid of being a micromanager that they've actually have pulled back on their coaching of people. And in that case, I have to actually help with coaching them that it's about situational leadership. It's about understanding your people that report into you and where they are in their career, in their level of experience, and thinking about each of the individual tasks or projects or work that that person is doing, and what do they need in terms of support? Do they need some more handholding at first? That's fine. You should be doing that, especially if this is new for the person. But if somebody's very experienced and that trust has been built, then you should be letting them run and kind of pulling back a little bit, maybe on your own internal tendency to micromanage. So that's one area. The two other areas are around understanding that, again, we're all in different places in terms of our skills and our ability to work remotely. Because these people that you've hired to work in your teams, you didn't hire them based on the remote work skills, especially if you were a co-located company before, a hybrid company before. So you have to understand where they are in their virtual leadership skill path so that you can determine who's an expert in some areas, who actually might need some skills training in some other areas. So actually what I'll do really quickly on that is I'm going to pull up just a slide real fast. 1 second here, just give you a little visual here. Can you see that, Lauren? This sheet here, perfect. So there's what I think of as 10 critical skill areas to be a successful virtual leader. And when I say leader, it doesn't mean that you have to actually have direct reports or have a fancy title, but that you are responsible for thought leadership, people leadership. So these areas here, if you want to do your own assessment of yourself or your team, there's this really just simple printout that I have as a free download on my website that you can go to, and you can grab it and use it with your team. And this way you can do this really quick assessment and see who's an expert or who needs some skills training help in areas like running effective virtual meetings or influencing across distance, which is one of what I think is the most important skills to be able to do when you can't run into key stakeholders at the water cooler or in the office. So you can get that tool from my website if needed. And the last thing I'll talk about is what's different than the norm is, in general, we need to have empathy for our teams, but this is a different level of empathy that's needed right now. I'm sure most of us have heard about that great analogy, which is, we're all kind of in the same storm, but we're all in different boats, meaning that we're all experiencing this pandemic, but in different ways. And so thinking about our team members, whether they're parents and they have a certain set of unique issues that they're dealing with. Like I'm a parent of two school-age kids right now. It's different than if you have single people who are reporting into you and they might be dealing with issues of isolation. And then there's people who have extreme health concerns during this time too. So really kind of thinking about the empathy piece of managing people.
Yeah, it sounds like it's really, there's no one size fits all management solution for the pandemic or in general. So it sounds like really paying attention to your team and what each person needs is really important. I really like that resource you shared. Maybe afterward we can chat and you could send over that and any other resources you have and we can email it to everyone who's here today.
Yes, I just put the link in the chat for everybody too, if they want like immediate access.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So diving into the topic of burnout, which we know is a serious issue more than ever. So why do you think that this pandemic causes burnout? On top of the communication struggles, I know you mentioned isolation and everything. Like, is there anything in particular about remote work, especially for new people, that you think is adding to that challenge?
So I want to reinforce that this is not normal remote work. So I started my company to help with virtual leadership training and remote work consulting about 2 years ago, so prior to the pandemic. And when I would talk about remote work, I would talk about kind of a seamless, controlled environment. So for me, I always had 2 locked doors between me and my kids. My kids always had some sort of childcare or school. This is not normal remote work. So this is extreme life work integration, or as one of my friends calls it, extreme work-life collision. And again, back to kind of my own personal experience during this pandemic has been that as I'm trying to juggle my kids and their needs and my work needs, what's happening is my normal schedule is all over the place. And for me, it's about, I have to, after the kids go to bed, that's when I get my real deep work time in. And that could be until 1 a.m., 2 a.m. at night. And then so that I can prepare for the next coming days. And so when it comes to burnout, right, having these different kinds of routines that can add up, right? So that's one thing, is just that we all are having to now kind of figure out how to work around our unique situations. Also, remote work guilt is a real thing. So this was something that I experienced significantly back in 2010 when I became that remote work pioneer, where you couldn't see my face around the building all day long, especially when we didn't have video conferencing like we did now. And I felt like I had to compensate for the fact that you couldn't see me there doing my work. And so I was trying to overcompensate by responding super fast to everything that I got, or being on every single meeting, whether I should have really been there or not. And so this is what's also happening, especially as many people are concerned about their job security in this kind of economy right now, is that they are really trying as hard as they can to keep everything together. So we need to just, as managers, keep an eye to that and help to lower that remote worker guilt. And we'll talk in a little bit. I know you have some questions kind of on that coming up.
Yeah, it sounds like that kind of anxiety to prove that you're working since people can't see you working definitely exists. So how do you know if your employees are suffering burnout? Because I'm sure a lot of people put on a happy face. You really, maybe their productivity isn't necessarily slipping. What kind of warning signs can we look for? Or how, other than warning signs, is there a certain way we can kind of assess questions we can ask to figure this out?
So I'm going to give you something that might sound counterintuitive, which is one of the signals for you is what's not being talked about. So for example, if somebody on your team is not asking you for help with prioritization on their work, or if somebody on your team is not coming to you with suggestions on prioritizing the work, that may mean that they are really trying to do everything, that they don't feel comfortable enough to actually push back or to help figure out that prioritization. So that's one area. Also, what's not being talked about, boundary setting. if you haven't had these conversations around some norms, like what are the expectations for me to be available for live synchronous meetings? Am I meant to be available for live meetings all day from 9 to 5 p.m. in my local time zone? Well, if that's the case, that might not be okay with your situation, especially if you have kids doing cyber school and you need to be available for them during certain times. Or back to boundary setting on responsiveness norms. So if you haven't had these conversations around, if I send you an email at 11 o'clock at night, because that's when I have been able to fit in my work, I don't expect a response from you. So having those conversations will allow you to reduce the burnout, to reduce that burden, to reduce that remote worker guilt. If you're not having those conversations, that's a signal that that burnout is happening or brewing.
Yeah, so it sounds like really boundary setting and just discuss, like having things out in the open, talking about your expectations is really important, because otherwise people will have that guilt and feel like, oh my God, I have to reply to this right now. So they know that I'm hardworking. So how else can what other role does communication play in burnout, and why can good communication practices, how can they help mitigate the burnout risk for your team?
You know, in addition to some of setting those expectations about your availability, your responsiveness, also thinking about the differences between asynchronous communication and synchronous communication, and which tools are we going to use to communicate with each other for what types of communication. Having worked in a large multinational company Clorox has been around over 100 years, and many of my clients are very long-standing companies, 50 years or more. You have these culture traits around putting a lot of emphasis on synchronous communication and collaboration, which is important. But when working in these hybrid and virtual environments, you need to think about asynchronous as well. So asynchronous meaning not real-time back and forth communication. So there is a role for synchronous communication, live, real-time. So video meetings, phone meetings, instant messages, but there's also a role for asynchronous. And that could be things like using threaded chats in Microsoft Teams or Slack. That could be emails, for example. And having every team is going to have a different situation in terms of how they want to set up those norms, but you have to have the conversations to set up the norms about how you're going to use those tools.
Yeah, it sounds like so asynchronous and synchronous communication, those are the big buzzwords of the remote work community. You see like remote work thought leaders on Twitter, they're always raving about asynchronous communication. You should never do anything synchronously. And then others are saying, no, but you need this, you need that face-to-face time. How do you strike that balance? And I'm sure it depends on the team and the person, your personal preference, but like you, with all of your experience with your team, what kind of balance do you find works best, and how do you manage that?
Right. I don't subscribe to the thought of it has to be one or the other. I actually think that there's a role for both. I think that there can be a blended point of view for any type of work. And so let's talk about that a little bit. And again, back to, you should be thinking about your team culture, the type of work you do, and adjusting it accordingly. But some of the questions that you can ask are things like, what's the goal of the communication to begin with? So there's a spectrum of things. So if the goal of the communication is more emotional, giving a feedback to somebody, giving a review to somebody, if the communication is more complex, like you're diving deep into a problem that you're trying to solve, you need heavy debate on something, then you might want to lean towards some synchronous communication. So a live video meeting, for example. But if the communication, the goal of it is more transactional, like an FYI on something, you could lean toward more asynchronous. If you need heavy documentation on something, more asynchronous, where people can go and read it at their leisure. But again, like I said, it doesn't have to be either or. So for example, I'm a huge proponent of having a blended approach for different types of work. So for example, often people think about brainstorming or ideation as a live synchronous event. Well, it should actually have pieces of both. So to enable an efficient and effective brainstorming session, you might want to start with an asynchronous piece where you ask people to contribute their ideas to a Google Doc or some sort of shared documentation, then have the facilitator have collated some of that into a starting and jumping off point for the synchronous part of the meeting. So you can have a blended approach.
Now that we're talking about the written communication that happens with asynchronous communication, I'm also curious, this is a question we didn't discuss before, but to toss in there, I know a lot of companies, especially huge remote companies with a lot of people, they like asynchronous communication because it kind of leaves like a paper trail. It leaves a written record of what's been said, what's been done. And so I know that's one benefit of asynchronous communication. And if you're doing it synchronously, like a video meeting, how do you keep track of everything that's happened so that other teammates who might not be there, might be in a different time zone, might not be online at that time, can keep track of progress and what's going on?
There are a couple of ways to do it. So like you're doing for this session today, you're recording it. So you're creating a recording, people can watch it at their own leisure. You have to be a little bit careful about whatever your legal requirements are within your organization. Some organizations, for legal reasons, will not let you record your meetings. So just check on that before you do that. So that's one thing that you can do. I'm a huge proponent of writing recaps of meetings, so meeting notes. And I would assign somebody ahead of time who is responsible for those meeting notes to capture next steps, to capture who is the owner of the next steps, to capture the key discussion points, and make sure that those are publicly available after the meeting. It is so easy in a virtual meeting to think that you all heard the same thing and leave and all be on different pages. So it is imperative to write meeting notes afterwards to get everybody literally on the same page.
Yeah, that's a great point. Definitely easier to avoid miscommunications when you have something concrete to look at together afterward. So there are all these great tools, ways to transcribe your meetings, record your meetings, and different ways to communicate: Slack, Microsoft Teams. There are 1,000 different remote work communication tools. What are your favorites, or what kinds of tools do you think are fundamental to each team, and how do you choose which ones to use when?
So this comes up a lot in terms of tools. So I'm actually going to share something else with you on the screen for just a second. Let me pull this up. Can you see that now? Okay, so this is my virtual leadership success framework, these 4 key areas to be a successful virtual leader. I created this because oftentimes people jump directly to the tech tools and training, and that being kind of the thing that they think is going to solve all their problems. So I just want to, before answering your question, and I will answer more specifically on those tech tools, I want to take a step back and say these other 3 areas are just as important, if not more important. So we've already talked a lot on this blue area about expectation setting. So it's critical and crucial, expectation setting with these communication norms, availability norms, etc. Then there's the relationship building and the culture building piece. We've touched on that a little bit, making sure that you have really intentional strategic plans to build your team culture and drive it across distance. And then those virtual skills that we talked about. So back to that assessment I gave you. So those 10 or so different skills, one of which is understanding which tool to use in the right scenario. So back to kind of your question here. So I think that the tools that are most useful, one is using video conferencing. And some of you may be surprised, but especially prior to the pandemic, a lot of the organizations that I was working with, again, large organizations, long-standing organizations, weren't even using video yet. And so I was helping with the change management process of getting people to know what buttons to press to turn it on and getting comfortable using the video. So maybe the positive part of all of this is that a lot of these organizations were forced to get to know what buttons to press on the video. But I think we're still in this learning curve of feeling comfortable on video. And I get it. I've been working remotely for over 10 years. When I first had to start using video back in 2010, as an introvert, I was extremely uncomfortable being on video, especially when I was the only one usually in the room on the video. So I would say video is a great tool. And if you are at the beginnings of just starting to use the video, you have to understand that you have to help your people along with their comfort level with video. The second tool is instant messaging. Again, some organizations, tech organizations, this is like a no-brainer, but some others, older organizations, this is new for them. How do I use it? When do I use it? And then the last two that I would like to touch on are what I mentioned before. So threaded or persistent chat. So using Microsoft Teams or Slack for that, because it is so much more searchable and contained than using email. Again, with the kinds of organizations that I work with, this is very new to them. This is something that they might have been using Microsoft Teams for a couple months before the pandemic, just for video or maybe just for instant messaging, but have not learned the power of using that and have not been able to actually use Slack prior to that because of security reasons. And the last one being workflow software. So having software that's cloud-based that allows you to see what projects are in process and who's responsible for the next task. So for example, Microsoft has Microsoft Planner, which can be integrated within Microsoft Teams. There's Asana, there's Trello, there's a bunch of these kinds of software. Again, most organizations that I work with have not been even introduced to this concept yet. So it's a big change management process to get them from, for example, at Clorox, we used to have like walls in the building where there were like sticky notes that people would move across the wall as a project moved on. Well, now that we're not in these locations, we need to have cloud-based softwares that enable us to stay connected on that work.
Yeah, that's really cool how people have created these tools that make it a lot easier to track progress of projects, because that saves you a lot of communication overload and time, just not having for a manager to have to constantly ask what's happening with something rather than just being able to click a button and see by themselves. So those are great tools. Something you mentioned a minute ago about meetings just sparked a new question. How do you manage a group of people where some are very extroverted and some are very introverted when you're doing a team meeting? Because there tends to be a couple people who don't talk as much as the others. And how do you make sure that they get a chance to be heard and included and get their voices heard?
Yes, really good point. So I see there are 4 markers of a really great virtual meeting, which is that it is efficient. So meaning you are making the best use of the time. It's effective, meaning you are getting out of it what you intended the objective to be. It's inclusive, meaning everybody can have a voice in the conversation, whether you're introverted or extroverted, whatever your style is, whatever the function is that you're bringing and your expertise to the table. And it's engaging, meaning it's holding your attention, because we know that it's so easy to multitask when you're in a virtual meeting. So you need to think about those 4 components. So you're asking on the inclusion front of things. So again, back to being a huge introvert myself, I had to, it was really hard at first to find my virtual voice, if you will, in these meetings, especially when back in 2010, I was the only virtual voice in the room. These were what are called hybrid meetings, which many of you, if you're working in a fully virtual situation right now, will probably be moving into hybrid situation sometime in the near future as some of the offices start opening back up. So this is really important here to think about those hybrid meetings where you have a group of people maybe co-located together and making sure that the voices are heard in the virtual part of the meeting. And how to do that? Well, a couple things. I always like starting with some sort of icebreaker, because I think icebreakers help for first getting the introverts to speak up earlier, helps them speak up later as well. It's also important in terms of helping with culture building, learning a little bit about each other, and also helping to make sure that the technology is working, because to be inclusive, you have to make sure that you literally can be heard. And so there's sometimes when I'm doing a training and I'm doing this round robin icebreaker, I find out that somebody can't get off of mute, it's not working. And then we have to, have IT help them or figure out how to make sure that they can be included in the conversation. So that's one way. And then in those hybrid meetings, something that I teach about is always having a buddy in the room. So if we get to the point where we have some people back co-located in a conference room together, having somebody in that room that can make space for the people who are calling in via video or phone to be able to speak up. So you need kind of this back channel of communication to that buddy in the room who, if you can't get a word in edgewise, who might say, hold on guys, hey, Sasha has something to say, Sasha, go ahead.
That's a great idea. I mean, someone who can actually maybe see your lips moving if you're stuck on mute or something and notify people. And I've actually never heard that tip before, and I love that. Just having a little buddy system to make sure no one gets forgotten or ignored there, because I know it's hard to interject as in a meeting when you're the only remote, or when you're hybrid like that. That'll be remote level 2. When people start going hybrid, there'll be a whole new world of problems that come with that, because I know that's not easy.
Yeah, I think that is like one of the key messages I want everybody to leave with right now, is that we've had a moment of this even playing field in these frogs, these fully remote organizations, which was hard because people are trying to get used to, how do I even work remotely, period. But hybrid is even harder. So when you get back into these groups that have some people co-located together and others not, what starts to happen is something called distance bias, which is our brain's natural tendency to put more importance on the people and things that are closer to us than those that are further away. This is something that the Neuro Leadership Institute talks about in their unconscious bias model. So this is something that you have to be really aware of to mitigate as we go back into these hybrid teams.
Yeah, it sounds like 2021 will have part 2 for all of your new challenges as people start to go back to the office. But hopefully many of you will like remote work and can stay fully remote, because I'm sure a lot of employees will be asking for that once they realize how much time they can save on the commute and once everything gets figured out so it runs smoothly. So back to video meetings. So we keep hearing the term Zoom fatigue everywhere. Actually, it's kind of ironic that we're on Zoom right now. Hopefully none of you are feeling too sick of Zoom at this very moment. But so how can we there are ways to combat Zoom fatigue, like by making our meetings like the aspects of a good meeting that you mentioned. So how can we make them less exhausting in general? Like how can we make them shorter, more efficient, more effective, and less boring?
Well, again, I'm going to say something that might feel controversial at first, but the first way to combat the video fatigue is to not have the meeting, period. So I implore on all of you, before you set up a meeting, and to first ask, do I really need a meeting for this? Or is there a different way for us to get to the objective that I have here? So just start with that. Because you may decide, if you take a moment to think about it before hitting the send on the invite, there's a different way asynchronously. So we talked about synchronous and asynchronous. So asynchronous meaning not live. There might be a way to do it asynchronously. So let's start with that. Then think about whether or not you want to use video. If you need a live synchronous meeting, so back to situational leadership, back to thinking about what's the intention of the meeting. Well, if it's something that is about building relationships, or something that's complex, or something where you need a lot of contextual clues, something that's emotional, like a feedback session, video is very, very helpful for that. And also, if it is a meeting where the majority of people are having their video on, I suggest you turn your video on too, because if you don't have your video on and the majority of the group does, it is as if you've taken a seat at the table down the hallway and you are actually not even in the meeting. Because back to distance bias, there's also something called recency bias, which is our brain's natural tendency to put more importance on the people and things that we've heard from or seen most recently. These things happen inside the meeting itself. So I facilitate a lot of virtual trainings with small groups, with large groups. And even as a facilitator, I know it happens to me where this bias comes up, where I sometimes am able to connect more with the people who have spoken up, whose faces I can see on the screen, versus those that might have dropped to the bottom that are just their acronyms. So you need to think about your own ability to influence in these meetings. It changes whether your video is on or not. But on the flip side, here's some situations where you might not want to use the video. So if you have an established relationship with the person, so if it's your direct report that you've known forever and you have a great rapport with them, use the phone, go out for a walk around your neighborhood, get some exercise and talk. Totally fine. If it's something really quick or transactional, yes, just pick up the phone. Or if you decide you want to all be on the same playing field with all on audio only, for example, if there's nothing that you need to share in terms of screen share, etc., You can go with that as well. So we're just really thinking about, what's the right tool for the situation.
Those are great points. I guess going back to when you don't need a meeting, what do you do if someone asks you for a meeting and you see it and you think this is really unnecessary? Like, how do you politely let them know or suggest doing written asynchronous communication instead?
Yes, great question here. So thinking about what I said about efficient, effective, inclusive, and engaging meetings, and thinking about if somebody's decided, yes, we're going to have a meeting because we have to have this live synchronous meeting. So I think having structure to that meeting is really important. So one other thing that I'm going to pull up for you, share this again on the link that I put in the chat. This is available in the free download as well. This is a 5 Ps framework for how to ensure a good virtual meeting. And again, I'm a big proponent of having agendas. So back to your question, if somebody sends out an invite and there's no agenda attached, or you don't understand what it is or why it is that you need to be involved, I know that some companies have like a no agenda, no meeting policy. So that they back to communication norms and principles, they set the expectation that if the inviter has not included an agenda, that you should decline the meeting. So that's one norm to an extreme. The other thing that you could do is very gently, politely say, what is it that you need to get out of the meeting? What is the agenda for the meeting? What is the objective for the meeting? And if they can't answer that, you might politely ask them to think about it, like this agenda framework, or ask or suggest an asynchronous or not live way to get to that outcome. So you can see on this 5 Ps agenda, it starts with a purpose, which is usually people have that, like usually in the title of the meeting, you can kind of understand the high level purpose. But where this falls down is usually people haven't gotten to the second P, which is product. What is the very specific intended outcome of the meeting? So for example, if I was going to have a meeting where the purpose was to talk about the timeline of a project, the product for that meeting should be, we will have left the meeting with a completed timeline and identification of the top 2 risks of the project. That's very, very specific. So you know, when have you achieved what you came to set out to do? And then that flows down into the process, like what is the way in which I'm going to keep people engaged in the meeting? How am I going to facilitate the session using what tech tools or what style? Is there pre-work? Back to what we talked about having a blended meeting. Well, have some asynchronous pre-work so people can do it whenever it fits into their schedule so that you can have a really short synchronous time together. And lastly, the people, who to invite to the meeting. Well, there's actually research that shows that if you invite more than 8 people to a meeting, the productivity and the efficiency of the meeting actually goes down. So thinking about getting a small group of the right people together in those meetings.
That's great. I love the way you organize these tips and strategies because it makes it easy to remember. So when you're in the moment, you're not looking for Sasha's document over there. You can think 5 Ps, which ones are they? That's great. I definitely would make a huge difference for people who aren't doing that to start doing this and make their meetings much more organized and effective. And also avoid them completely when they're useless and just a waste of time, even though we love seeing each other's faces, but it'd be more fun to just do something fun together on Zoom than have meetings for every little thing. So when we don't have meetings, we use written communication. So whether that's email, Slack, Microsoft Teams, can you share a few tips for better written communication, like how to avoid miscommunications and be more efficient, get your message heard clearly?
Sure. So I'll jump into that. And then if anybody else has questions in the group, I don't see any in the chat right now. I'm not sure if Debbie behind the scenes sees any yet, but please feel free to pop that in there because we'd like to hear from you as well. So in terms of written communication, so brevity is important, especially when right now it's like email overload and we're getting pinged and dinged from everywhere. But we need to be careful that often brevity is in the sake of clarity. So the clarity, it doesn't always come through as people are trying to be brief. Text messaging is the best example of this. So I used to have a manager who loved text messaging, and that was fine for me because it was quick back and forth, but she would never check to see if it was autocorrecting. And so I would get these messages And I would sit there just trying to decipher what it was that she was trying to tell me. And so it actually then makes things harder, right? It takes more time for me to figure out what it is that she wants me to do, or I might misinterpret it and do the wrong thing. And when you're in a virtual situation, if the communication is not clear, you don't see that quizzical look on the other person's face, right? So you're missing those context clues.
And just to do a whole meeting for one question and trying to figure out the code of autocorrect.
Yeah, and then tone too, right? So tone can be super misinterpreted over written communication. I think there was a time where people were hesitant to use emoticons in business communication, but I actually think it's helpful to help think about what is the right emoticon to use or right shorthand to use to actually add some tone to your written communication as well.
What's your most used emoji in your written communication for work?
I think it always, like, the easiest one, which is just the smiley face, right? Just to make sure that, like, what comes across is like could be a very blunt statement written, is you understand that I'm not saying it in the blunt way in which it might come across.
Yeah, I think that's important. I know that people tend to interpret messages negatively when they can't hear or feel the tone. So that's, the smile is a nice addition, especially if you think it could be interpreted as too blunt or kind of rude. So now that we've covered so many different ways to communicate and different tips for this, as we move forward, how do we know, or right now, if we're just reflecting on what our own teams are doing, how can we tell if our communication practices are working well? And how can we identify problems?
I think having a feedback loop for just about everything is important. So that could be qualitatively, meaning asking just one-on-one how things are going. And it can be quantitatively. So putting out little surveys. I'm a huge proponent with my clients where we do some of these assessments, especially for teams that have just started working remotely or will be working in a hybrid way, where we understand how they're doing right now and get kind of data at the beginning and then track the data over time. So asking questions about how things are going in terms of communication, asking questions about how things are going in terms of burnout, and tracking that progress over time and seeing where it's changing. So making sure that you actually have a strategic plan, an intentional plan to get that feedback loop.
Yeah, that's it's really important to ask for people's feedback. Otherwise, you have no idea if anyone's happy or not, as everyone tends to put on a happy face at work. So if you find problems in your team's communication, if you see everyone's rating your communication a 2 out of 10, and then you figure out how to improve that and what you want to do to improve it, how do you get people to actually do it? Because everyone will have their what they're used to, and like, how do you set these expectations for your team of like when we want you to be online, how fast or slow you can reply to our asynchronous messages, when to use a meeting versus not? How do you set these expectations?
So I think it's discussions. So I think, again, every team's going to be different in what they need. So there's no one size fits all set of norms that can be created. There's no one size fits all norms that can be created company-wide or even like functional wide. Some of these things can, but they actually need to be refined by the smaller and smaller teams. And so having open dialogue and conversations about this and adjusting as necessary, because it should be a test and learn. It should be put something in place. Like we just talked about feedback, get feedback on it. If it's not working, adjust it. And you then need to reinforce some of these things, right? So for example, we've talked a little bit about culture. Well, culture is the values, beliefs, attitudes, and behavior of a team. How do we work together? How do we treat each other? And in order to continue to build and drive culture, you need to reinforce those values. So if you are the leader of the team or you're the manager of a group of people, you need to think about what is your intentional plan to reinforce those values. And so it could be through recognition, for example. Like I think we need to all make sure that we're doing a good job of recognizing people during this time, because that might have fallen to the back burner. But the recognition is always a chance to build that culture. So recognizing people in terms of the values that you've set for the team to begin with. And so that will reinforce to others through the role modeling. And the role modeling is so important. So for example, you can't set a norm that is no meetings after 3 p.m. on Friday and then set up a meeting as a leader at 3 p.m. on Fridays. I see this all the time, and it's mind-boggling. And it actually then starts to erode the trust within the team, and it starts to create a negative impact. So as the leader within the organization, please make sure that you are role modeling the expectations that you've set.
Yeah, so setting an example, leading by example, is definitely a great way to get your team on board too, and show them that it works too. Because if you start trying it out, showing them how well it works, then they'll realize that and want to do the same. So as we wrap up to our Q&A portion, what do you want? Like, what do you think is one of the most important takeaways that you want our audience to remember when thinking about communication for their remote teams?
I think it's back to knowing that this is not normal remote work. So it's requiring an extreme amount of empathy for each other right now, and just starting with that and really understanding what each person's unique situation is and how that is going to continuously change over time. It's not static. Week by week, things are changing. So back to an example, we talked a little bit about, my experience coming as a parent, right, where we had the summer, and I saw this in some of the research I did with one of my clients. The summer actually allowed a little bit of a reprieve for parents. Even though they still had most of their kids home with them, they weren't responsible for helping with their education. Then as we moved into the fall, that new responsibility popped up again. And so again, things changed in terms of their ability to manage this extreme work-life integration. So knowing this is not normal remote work, knowing that you have to have extreme sense of empathy, and then knowing that this is going to change, as we also mentioned, where we're going to go into the second phase of hybrid teams after this, which is going to come with a whole new set of challenges. So preparing for really good virtual leadership, best practices, and communication right now will help you into that hybrid transition later.
Thank you. Yeah, it's definitely the word we're so sick of hearing, unprecedented. But everyone should, even if your team's not on top of the game, you're not perfect right now, you shouldn't be too hard on yourselves, because it's a very stressful time for everyone, whether or not you have children, whatever's going on in your life. We all know that 2020 is not our favorite year that we've spent in our lives so far. So now I'd like to welcome our audience to ask questions. You can share them in the chat. And if anyone has a question where they prefer to remain anonymous, you're welcome to just select my name from the drop-down menu within the chat box, and just send it straight to me so I can read it out. I won't say your name. So let's see. For now, we have a couple questions. The first one, many of us are hiring remotely. Do you have any tips for effectively onboarding remote employees, including making people feel part of the team?
Yes, this is hard. So we talked a little bit earlier about how those teams that went from working together before the pandemic to all of a sudden going remote, they at least had some social capital built up. So they had some relationship built, some trust built, and so had an easier time transitioning. Now we're in this phase where people are getting hired in completely remotely, and it's really hard. So I think the first thing is to help the people get a sense of what the culture is of the company. So there's one piece, which is, I'm sure most large organizations have kind of written down what their mission is, what their values are, right? But a lot of that is picked up within these organic interactions between people. And when we are working remotely, you only get slivers of that behind these kind of virtual curtains that you get to see, these peaks that you get to see. So giving these people, other people within the organization, that they can start to build that relationship through it, whether it's virtual coffee chats or some sort of connectivity, so that they can kind of help get a feel for the place by talking to people who are at different levels within the organization, that are within different functions within the organization. That's number one. Number two is thinking about helping them understand what their sphere of influence is. So one of the workshops that I give is on influencing across distance. It's this really critical skill for us to be able to hit our business objectives, hit our career objectives. And I go through a 5-step process for everybody to create their own personal virtual influence plan. So to help people understand, how do they influence others when they can't run into each other at the water cooler or on the way to the elevator, etc. And the first step in that workshop is for us to draw, everybody draws an influence map, their sphere of influence. Who are the people they need to influence up, down, across, inside, outside the organization? And what I've found from having people start on my team working remotely in the past is that unless you do this really intentional exercise with them, they actually are very blind to how big their sphere of influence actually should be, because they haven't been able to visually see some of those interactions in the office and kind of see how all these people tie together within their work process. So it's really important that a manager helps to draw out what these spheres of influence are for the new hire when they come in.
Yeah, it's definitely, I can't imagine being a new hire for a team that's been together in person before this too. It's definitely a challenge, but I think with all of the great tools we have, it's absolutely doable. And let's see, we have one more question. So as you mentioned, remote work guilt, what's the best way to communicate this issue with your team members and just let them know that they're not required to be on call 24/7?
So it's back to expectation setting. It's talking about what are your operating principles within your team. Oftentimes I get into this debate with people about when to reply to certain things. So there's a school of thoughts, which is I'm going to respond to something. I'm going to write the email at 12 o'clock at night, 1 o'clock at night, but I'm going to schedule it to go at 9 a.m. Or I'm going to write the email at 7 o'clock at night, but schedule it to go out at 7 o'clock in the morning. And that is one school of thought. I will give you an example though, where that happened to me, where I had a direct report who worked on the West Coast who would do that consistently, who she would schedule the emails to come at 9 a.m. for me, East Coast, the next day. That stressed me out to no end, because 9 a.m. was when my day was starting to rev up and I actually couldn't respond. I couldn't get to that question. I would have preferred she just send it when she wanted to send it. And then I decide when I want to respond to it or deal with whatever the communication is. So my point being, you can't make any assumptions about how the others on your team actually want to handle this kind of thing in terms of the expectation setting. You have to have these conversations. And I know today we're talking a lot about the remote manager direct report relationship. And so I do a whole workshop on successful remote reporting relationships. And one of the things that we do is we go through kind of this checklist of the things that you need to talk about in your one-on-one with each of your direct reports, because it's going to be different. Back to situational leadership, it's going to be different. So you can say things like, if I send you an email at a weird time, I don't expect you to respond. That's one thing that you can say. Or you might find that somebody gets totally stressed out that even if you said, if I send it at 11 o'clock, I don't want a response, and that stresses them out, then you know that you need to schedule it to send the next morning. So it's a lot about kind of being flexible based on the person that you're working with.
Yeah, that's good if alongside setting expectations for your team, just to figure out what works for each person and what stresses them out or not. Or if someone needs their Slack to be at 0 notifications when they go to bed, try not to send it before bed or something, and send an email instead maybe. I know for me, when I send a message to a teammate where I know that they should not be working at that time, I'll just say, don't reply, do this later. Like, mark me as unread for a while and get back to me tomorrow.
Yeah, that's a really great tip too, is to put something, if it's an email, for example, in the header saying response not required right now, or time bounding something that says, if you're going to work on this, I only need, you should only be spending 20 minutes on it. So that's giving, again, a clue to what your expectation is for the type of work you're being asked or asking them to do.
Yeah, I think being transparent about those expectations is really helpful. So I think that looks like all of our questions for now. If anyone has any others, you can toss them in. We can see how we can address them in the future. But
can I ask something of the group?
Sure.
So for everybody who's still listening, if you're multitasking, come back to me for a moment. Could everybody pop into the chat one new thing that you're going to go try from today's discussion? So I'd just love to see kind of if there's any kind of pattern that pops to the top of what people are gravitating toward, or if it's, usually when I do this, when I do my big training sessions, like it's all over the board, which I love because everybody kind of pulls a different tool that they learn from the session. So if everybody who's still listening, just put into the chat one new thing that you're going to go try from what you heard about today. So I see Holly's going to try icebreakers. Great. You can assign different people to be in charge of the icebreakers for each meeting, so don't feel like you have to be responsible every single time.
Yeah, there are a lot of, if you just Google virtual icebreaker questions, you can find a lot of lists, so you never run out of questions. Some of them are kind of weird though, so you'll have to filter through what you find in Google.
Carolyn, hi, nice to see your voice on there. Carolyn and I work together at Clorox. So she's going to look in Teams to see if she can figure out the progress tracker. Yes, so Microsoft Teams Planner, check that out. Paul's going to confirm the schedule said makes sense for the recipient. Great. Chris is going to manage his response time. So yeah, make sure that you're not responding right away with that remote worker guilt if it's not necessary. I see somebody, private DM said, new hires, they're going to use that influence mapping that I talked about. Talking about marking when a response is expected. Great. Making sure you can get to this later. Great. All right. Nice. Perfect. Well, thank you all for sharing. I'm really happy that you all took away something really tangible that you can go try and go do.
Yeah, that's great. I'm glad everyone's willing to try these new things, and you'll have to report back to us and let us know how they go. So now that we're coming to the end of this, for those of you who would like to connect with each other, get to know a couple other remote managers, I would like to invite you to stick around for a short networking session. Be super casual, about 10 minutes long. So if you would like to stay, please stay, and I'll give you a minute for those of you who want to escape to filter out. For those of you who are leaving now, if you're interested in staying tuned for future events or getting more remote management tips, you can follow us on Twitter at arc.dev. That's at arc.dev. And you can also find us on LinkedIn and Facebook. We share remote management tips and strategies, and we also post about whenever we're doing new webinars.